Planning as design. Planning has actually emerged from two somewhat related but distinct traditions. The first evolved from architecture and landscape architecture, the physical organization of land uses, and the creation of their architecturally styled connections into a coherent environment that is today often called urban design. The second is strongly grounded in the tradition of law, the legal rationale for imposing public limitations on the use of private land. The legacy of the first tradition, planning as design, is the comprehensive plan, or what we call in California the general plan. The legacy of the second tradition is our system of land use regulations. These are the extremely detailed and legalistic set of rules about land and activities on the land that is called zoning. Let's start with the history of planning as urban design. The great urbanist Louis Mumford once wrote that all that is good about American city planning began with the design of Central Park. It's hard to imagine what New York City would look like without Central Park. In 1853, the city of New York used the power of eminent domain to acquire 778 acres from 59th Street to 106th Street that would comprise Central Park. 10 years later, the park would extend to 110th Street. 1,600 people living on this land as renters were evacuated along with the school and 3 churches. Frederick Law Olmsted was appointed as the designer of the park, and the genius of his work was to avoid the common European-style formal gardens and create an environment that impacted landscape planning America for generations to come. The short walkways would achieve an intimate scale proper to the common person, who in the best sense is the true owner of the park, as Olmsted put it. His vision influenced the development of parks across the country. A few decades later, a city planning movement began in the United States in response to crowding of inner cities called City Beautiful movement. The concentration of this movement was on formal streetscaping and Beaux-Arts architecture. The advocates believed on the influence of beautiful urban form on a harmonious social order that would increase the quality of life, while critics would complain that the movement was overly concerned with aesthetics at the expense of social reform. About the same time, the other influential urban design concept in late 19th century was the Garden City movement by Ebenezer Howard in the United Kingdom. This urban planning model suggests self-contained communities surrounded by green belts. When a garden city reached full population of about 30,000 to 60,000 people, another garden city would be developed nearby. Some communities around the world have been developed with garden city concepts. Clarence Stein was a major proponent of the Garden City movement in the United States. Inspired by the concept of self-contained units, Clarence Perry in 1929 proposed the concept of the neighborhood unit plan, a residential community with community buildings such as schools and churches at the center, and then the commercial uses on the periphery of the unit next to the major roads and highways. In the continuation of landscape architecture influence on city planning in America, we have architects such as William Priera, who designed UC Irvine and the first master plan of Irvine City. Priera envisioned UCI to evolve around 2 concentric rings with a park as its center. The northern part of the ring would be the hub of the campus. Unlike other developers who simply built houses and a shopping mall, the Irvine Company, at Priera's direction, created the footprint of an entire community from scratch, which later becomes the city of Irvine. It might be interesting for you to know that Priera is also the architect of Geisel Library on the UCSD campus. On a different path of urban design, we have John Nolan, an American landscape architect planning consultant who can be considered as the father of comprehensive city planning in America. He was the planner for many cities during the early years of 20th century, including the 1909 Plan of San Diego. His style was somewhat formal, almost Baroque city arrangements with parks and open spaces and strong emphasis on public buildings and public spaces. While Clarence Stein and the Garden City proponents sought to create a village atmosphere in their developments by incorporating farmlands and natural areas into their design, which at the same time made their developments car-oriented, we have Nolan and his followers who design around urban streets, a principle many new urbanists later adopt during the 1990s. According to the formal website of Congress of New Urbanism is a planning development approach based on the principles of how cities and towns had been built for the last several centuries. Walkable blocks, housing and shopping in close proximity, and accessible public spaces with focus on human-scale development. This movement was an alternative to the sprawling, single-use, low-density patterns typical of post-World War II development. However, it has been criticized for asserting universal principles of design instead of attention to local history, values, and environmental conditions, and prevent creativity of other architects and urban designers. This is still an ongoing debate between proponents and opponents of new urbanism.